Hi, this is A.A. Rubin with Comic Book School for another edition of Bullpen Academy. Today I have with me Warwick Johnson-Cadwell. He's the author and illustrator of Falconspeare from Dark Horse. How you doing tonight?
Hi, great, great. Yeah, good, thanks. You?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. I
Good,
gotta
good.
tell you, I love the book. I read the review copy. I love the book, and I'm looking forward to talking about it.
Oh, brilliant. No, thanks very much. That's much appreciated.
Yeah. So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do in the comics world?
Well, yeah. I'm an artist and an illustrator. Have been for many years, sort of on and off with other jobs and bits and pieces. But I have done a variety of titles, Samurai Jack, and I did a short series for IDW. Did Tank Girl. Have done Helena Crash, but for Dark Horse, this is the third book in a series of vampire hunting adventures or other supernatural sort of creatures, and it's something I really enjoy. It's from a subject that I've got a lot of love for. So the first of which was I was invited to join in by Mike Mignola, who did the covers of
Very
the
cool.
books and wrote the first. But then I've subsequently written and illustrated the second and the third books.
That's very cool. And can you tell us a little bit about the new book?
Yes, it's a bit of a sort of a spoiler hazard, just because the story's quite lean, and so there are three main characters, which have been two of them from the first book. Mr. Higgins Comes Home. Then the second book, two returned and joined by there's the professor and Mr. Knox, and then there's Mary Van Sloan joins them in the third. Falconspeare kind of brings us the opening. The first chapter or sequence is back to their formative years, learning, training, getting to grips with vampire hunting, and there's a fourth member of the group there, a James Falconspeare. He, as they have grown and adventures have carried them into different places, he's been left behind and sort of not forgotten but lost. And they are communicated and see if they track down, find out what has happened to their partner of old.
And I really
So
like
that's the story.
that's cool. And I really like the mystery of it. And yes, it was a
Yeah,
monster
thank
hunter
you.
story, but it was also kind of a mystery as well.
Yeah, it was interesting. There's a few things I really wanted to sort of get across in terms of the story, and trying to tell that comfortably was quite a challenge, because I think some of the other stuff's been, well, see, Mike Mignola wrote the first one and his script was amazing. So getting into the second, trying to work out how these stories go, and some of them are sort of more action based or sort of something like that, whereas this was a different sort of pacing, and was great fun to try and do, a real puzzle.
Can you talk a little bit about that pacing and some of the challenges with it?
Yeah, yeah. Well, my strength is I'm an artist. I've been drawing for always, and that's been my strength. And I like narrative, and I like creating stories. But writing as a craft is relatively new to me, and a tendency I find to sort of getting quickly to the point. The stories can be quite lean, so I'm relying on the artistic side, the staging and sort of the acting of the characters on the paper, without necessarily the dialogue, to try and balance it. I try to. I don't want to get too flowery with the dialogue and add stuff that's not needed. But that's quite a challenge, and trying to get the right sort of amount, trying to carry things over. And so it's quite fun. One of the working with Mike Mignola on Mr. Higgins, one trick I learned was he scripted the pages, and then I redrew the roughs. I drew the roughs, and then they went back, and we'd chat about it. But he would hold on to the final dialogue till after the pages were drawn, and the benefit there is if you feel that something is not being communicated well enough, you can adjust the dialogue, or more helpfully, certainly with a visual medium like comics, if you find that some of the dialogue becomes redundant because the artwork is carrying it well enough, then you can actually take out some of the dialogue if you don't feel it's necessary. So these two elements together, you can look at, well, the dialogue and the way the art comes together. And that could be in terms of sort of the acting of the characters on the page, or the setting, or the panels, or how you pace it. There's lots of different sort of visual elements that you could review once you've got them on the paper.
So I want to get into that a little bit, because the visual storytelling in this book is so strong, and it is a leaner in terms of dialogue and captions than even what you see in most comic books, which tend to be a lean medium to begin with. Can you give advice to up and coming artists about how to use your art to tell a story as opposed to just drawing something well?
Well, I mean, yes, and the bottom line is always, and sort of sometimes frustrating, but it's just practice. It's just working at it, and there's lots of, there's so much you can try to practice, because what you're doing is you're trying to work out how people move. When people are talking, they're communicating, whether it's their eyes or their hands or their body, obviously their body language. And so having two people on the page in a panel, with dialogue, doesn't necessarily sell it. It could be contrary, because if you don't get it right, it could be contrary to the dialogue. So it might be confusing and people might not pick up straight away why. Or it could be, misleading. There's a lot of things, but there's lots of. It's just sort of following what people do, watching people. Whether it's watching people when you're watching telly, watching actors, you could do that in your own home. So, or if you're out and about, watching people, how they act in public, how different people stand, different shapes and sizes of people. People, there's lots of ways of communicating. Dialogue, but also sort of character and bits and pieces, and it is, lots to do with people's shapes and sizes. I mean, that could be to do with their clothes rather than their physical body shape. Someone with a big hat, someone with a coat that's blowing in the wind, that changes their shape and size. These things can all work with it, and there's other ways as well. Just exercises that everyone's got a phone and they've got access, everyone's got their messages, generally speaking, and there's your dialogue. You don't need to find a script. You don't need to find a script that's written or go through books. You just go through your messages, find something, don't spend too long, just say, right, the fifth conversation down the list, I'll look no further than 3 sort of screens down, and just find a conversation that you've had, it could be with your mum, it could be organizing shopping or meeting some people somewhere. Draw that. You've got figures, whether they're, giant robots or people or mice or whatever, and then have them do the conversation. And then you can practice. You can see how that works. You see how this, what looks better than other things. And sometimes that could be just quite helpful, just very simple 3 or 4 lines of dialogue, but try it in different ways and see which works best.
That's a great exercise. I love that. I also really liked how in the story, how you would direct the eye like to a hand or to a gesture or to an expression before a reveal or something like that. Can you talk a little bit about choosing what to focus on in terms of how you're revealing that information to the reader?
Well, one of the reasons why comics is such an exciting medium, or such a fun medium to work in, is that you can do anything. You can, and more and more you can do with film, with effects, and effects are getting easier. People can video stuff with their phones, and you've got all. But comics is because you can do so much with it. So having a fairly, a plain and standard panel to panel, it's not my cup of tea. My art, my artwork would fit certain stories and not others. It's never going to be sort of a Daredevil, a standard Daredevil issue or something like that. And this is where I get to play around because I don't have to worry about, you know, I can experiment a bit more is what I'm trying to say. And so by doing that, and so again, sort of stage actions, and you can prompt the reader who's also a participant. It's quite unusual as a medium because it requires quite a lot of interaction. So, you know, you're not changing things on the page, but comics, you people are sort of to get a handle, you know, they learn because people start reading comics when they're very small generally. And so you understand how that all works. But it's a fun medium because you can sort of play with it. Because you can have stage it so easily. You're just drawing what you want. So it's easy to manipulate a tree branch into a pointing finger, or just from one panel to the next, and people might not even notice, or it might be, you know, fairly obvious. But it's just a fun way to continue the story.
Well, that's really interesting. I really liked. I don't want to give away any spoilers, but there was a particular gesture involved that I noticed when it came back at the end that I had seen this similar thing much earlier in the book, and I really liked how you seeded that, so that you knew exactly what was happening at the end, but you didn't realize that you were being set up for it necessarily as you were reading it.
Yeah, you can afford to be subtle, and again with comics, because you can rewind it at any stage. You know, you can read it over and over. Which you can do with films, but there is a time constraint. Whereas I like books myself that I could read, but then I could also just wander over the pages, you know, go back to the bits I liked. And so you could spend more time with it. So I don't mind too much if the story feels, if they're quite quick to get through, because I feel like you could read it a second time and find more in there. There's, you know, I don't necessarily think I'd go hunting to hide things there for people, and you know, with a big sort of a smirk on my face, thinking, did someone spot this, that, or the other? But I mean, I do some work with animation and 3D animation. The stop motion is when you see how much time is spent on each of the frames and bits and pieces, then you see that there's so much inside it all, and you know, you could just sort of look at it for hours. And so it's nice to have a book that, you know, you can read and then read again, and there will be things, you know, that you might not have seen the first time that might change your reading a bit, or maybe just change your enjoyment of it a bit. So
cool.
I like that. Yeah, I like that.
Cool. And I wanted to ask you, because you said the first one you worked on with Mike Mignola in the series, and then this one you wrote and you illustrated yourself. So can you talk a little bit, because we have a lot of information as aspiring comic creators about what the writer does and what the artist does, and the process of it, if you have the different roles from writer to penciler to inker to colorist, all that type of thing. But as someone who does it kind of all, one of the writer/artist or artist/writer, how is your process similar to or different from the more traditional process of having a writer and an artist?
Well, there's a few. I mean, there are differences. There's quite a lot. I mean, there's lots to talk about, I guess. But I mean, my first thought, as you mentioned, is being an artist is you can choose what the writer wants you to draw, because what you don't necessarily, well, people may not want, you know, they shy away from giant crowd scenes, or they shy away from things you don't like drawing. And so you can guide the story, guide it that way, which is, I mean, it's completely valid. I mean, it may be being a bit cheeky because you're not going to make a story just of the things you don't want to draw, but that's a helpful sort of element. But I personally start by drawing. My plans are sort of visual, and I don't tend to have an image in my head of how it's going to come out on the page. I've got ideas in my head, you know, and maybe it's like almost like a moving image, like a film, or if it's just ideas, but it's worked out on the page. So I end up with, I work in pencil on paper, so I just end up with piles and piles of pages of paper.
So you start with the drawing before you write the script, such as this?
I draw, obviously you draw characters, but there's some actions, and then I draw thumbnails. And it's funny because with Mr. Higgins' script, Mike Mignola he sent a script, and it was a page, and it was bullet points for the actions that were happening. He didn't say how many panels, he didn't say necessarily this, that, and the other, but that he would say if there's something particular happening and the dialogue that was likely to go there. So in terms of that, I was already laying out the pages myself, which then went back to make sure he was keen and happy with those. So there was an element of that sort of working out before. But what I've been doing since I've been writing it myself, again, I start in the same way. I'm trying to work out what's going to go on each page. I tend to draw it in a very tiny fashion and then work the script out from that point, and then go back again to do the layouts at that stage, which could actually be very similar to the original sort of sketch.
So you kind of do the thumbnails before the script then, and then come back to it after.
Well, yes, they won't be the same.
Right.
Sometimes they might, because you might have certain actions that you really want to work. You like how they work, so that's what's going to go part of it, the important part of the story. So you might have that quite well worked out when you're doing it first. But there's a lot that you might put out as layouts, and then as you're writing the script, you're suddenly thinking of other bits, and then second process of layouts, it changes again, and then it can all change. Mr. Higgins was, and it's a similar thing I've used with the other books, is then layouts go to roughs, but the roughs weren't on a page. I wasn't doing a rough in a format. Each panel I tended to draw separately, and then they would be scanned, and then I would put this page together. And at that stage, I could then change or crop or fiddle or flip the roughs. So then the page would come out digitally, and then I would draw it from there. So I'd print it out and then lightbox. And the thing with that is that some of the panels, the top panel of one of the pages, the rough for that would be what we have a A3 size, so more than double a comic page. But then that would be scanned and then shrunk down to the drawing size, and then of course shrunk down again to be printed. So that's how I got to sort of play around with a lot of the detailing and stuff in those stories, because the panels started off much bigger. They were drawn sort of on the comic board size. So that was a fun process, because even then, as I say, you could edit them. So you had an A3 size image, but then you could zoom into it, or you could just, your details could continue. So
that's cool. That's cool. I love the detail, and I love hearing about the process, the creative process that different creators have. We ask all of our guests on this program and on all the comic book school programs if for a piece of advice that you wish someone had given you at the beginning of your career. They call it the pro tip. So something that you know now that you wish someone had told you when you were starting out.
Well, the one thing I do always remember, which was something we were told at college by Dave McKean, was he said, do something every day and always finish what you start. And that's always been a great piece of advice. And I try to stick to that. But I think a lot of the other pieces of advice would be things that I haven't, that I need to remember. Those advice that I haven't stuck to, just we should just make sure you keep on top of your timetable is probably the big one, because you can get yourself into all sorts of bother, late nights. The story, two artists, UK artists from 2000 AD, which was a magazine I grew up with, Judge Dredd and ABC Origin, bits and pieces like that. Dave Gibbons and Mick McMahon in the same studio. And I remember hearing that Dave Gibbons would work his hours, 6 o'clock, whatever, that's it, pens away, and he'd go. And Mick McMahon would still be there working on the first or second panel that he'd been doing all day, and then so Dave Gibbons got to go home and have an evening, and Mick McMahon would be up all night finishing his pages. And that's a key, find yourself a time and do it in a way that you're not doing the all-nighters and all that sort of stuff.
Cool. Is there anything
That's,
else you want to add before we wrap up?
uh, no, I mean, I no, I can't think of anything particular.
All right. So why don't you
Yeah.
tell them where they can find you online and social media and everything to where they can follow you and find your work?
Busiest and easiest on Instagram. I'm at Wocco, WOCCO, on Instagram. That's where most of my work goes up. On Twitter at Warwick JC. Warwick Johnson-Cadwell.co.uk is my website. And there's a Patreon as well, which is at Wocco again, Patreon/@ Wocco, or just Wocco. And it's a pretty sleepy Patreon. But yeah, so I mean, primarily Instagram's the busiest, as I say. I like its simplicity and the fact that I don't have to talk to anyone. I can just put up the pictures, put up the work and leave it.
All right, very cool. This has been in another edition of Bullpen Academy with Comic Book School. I'm A.A. Rubin, and we'll see you next time when we talk to creators about the craft and business about making comics.